Okay, so let's talk a little bit about network forensics. Um, so this is intended to be the first part of a two-part lecture, although by itself it is a standalone lecture too. So um, let's just think a little bit about that. So whether we're talking about any type of topic like, say, cybercrime or malicious software, whatever the topic of conversation might be, it really is quite important to us to understand a little bit about the network and network forensics and where we can get information and how we can learn about that and so on. So what we're going to look at is where we can get, obviously, digital evidence from networks. What would we find there? So what kind of evidence would we get? Very important to our conversation. Um, what are the differences essentially between wired and wireless networks? Um, can we get, for example, information or data? Can we capture data easier off of a wireless network than off of a wired? Or is the statefulness, in other words, the persistence of that data more easy to, or is it more robust on one type of network over the other? Um, so in order to fully understand networks, it's really important that we understand something called TCP/IP. Now, for the most part, um, when we're talking about these protocols in this particular lecture, it's mostly theoretical. On the other hand, we should know some things. So TCP/IP is the backbone of the internet. In other words, the TCP is the fundamental protocol that's used over the World Wide Web today. It is a original protocol developed back in the 1960s, early 1970s. The important thing to know, one of the very important things to know is that there is no security built in. So no built-in security. Now, there are a number of protocols that we essentially can look at with respect to TCP/IP. We can talk about something called Telnet. And Telnet is a pretty widely known, quite widely used, I would say, in the hacker community. And the reason being is that Telnet is extremely flexible. Now, I'm working with a fairly new server, so let me see if I've got Telnet installed here. Okay. So this is a server that's just being set up. And so a lot of things are not installed yet. So we look at Telnet. Why is Telnet really kind of important to us? Well, if I use Telnet creatively, I can, for example, use Telnet to a web server, for example. So I'm going to use localhost, and I'm going to use port 80, which is the HTTP port. And you'll see that it's connected to a web server. Now, if I was to, for example, use get space /space HTTP /1.0 and hit the enter key twice, you'll see that I get the contents of a web page. So if I've got a web browser here, and I bring in a web browser, and I go to class.taliaq.com, you see that it gets the same web page. So Telnet is extremely flexible. I can use Telnet to essentially simulate any of the other network protocols. So Telnet is quite commonly used by hackers, people like that. I'm going to use the term hacker for lack of a better word. FTP is a similar protocol. FTP is file transfer protocol. World Wide Web, where we find web pages, etc. Emails, we think SMTP, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, POP, that's the Post Office Protocol, and of course we could also think about Exchange, and various related protocols that go along with this. So one of the things that we need to understand about networks is that criminals on a network can be anywhere in the world at any time. Okay, so it doesn't matter if this is a bot herder, so somebody running a bunch of bots or a networked series of owned computers that have been taken over using some type of technique, generally a drive-by download, something like that, or whether it's somebody engaged in child exploitation, somebody who's hacked into a computer working through a proxy, all these types of examples. The network does allow people to cross borders instantly and almost invisibly. So challenges that we come across when we're looking at these things is, first of all, the crimes involved can involve several computer systems. So we might have a bad guy. The bad guy works through a proxy, so let's say a proxy. So let's say our bad guy's in Russia, works through a proxy in Ghana, and is attacking computers in Europe. So what you see here is that this our one bad guy is actually able to, at one instant, be using computers in three more geographic locations. Problems that we have with that is the administrative domains. So from an enforcement perspective, we have an issue that arises in that we don't have access to all those jurisdictions. In other words, the different jurisdictions may have different legal systems. They may not necessarily have treaties with us in whatever country we're working out of. Leads to some problems. For example, how do we get evidence? We need the cooperation. We need the network administrators. I shouldn't even say the network, but network and system admins. We need cooperation from law enforcement. Oops, let me erase that. And so on. Big issue, different legal systems. In other words, bad people have different rights in different countries. There are different rules for evidence. There are different rules for what you can investigate, different rules for what you can't investigate. All of this stuff comes into play. The evidence may not necessarily meet legal criteria. So if we're going to take legal action against somebody, we have to make sure that our evidence meets the criteria for the country in which we are going to present that. We have to be sure that our evidence is gathered legally. Is it admissible in court? In some countries, the source of evidence, or I should say, the standards, are very flimsy. In some countries, it's very, very rigid. The United States, Canada, Western Europe all have fairly rigid rules around evidence. And respecting the rights of the accused. We don't necessarily see that in some other countries. Another country doesn't have to disclose all the information you're looking for. And in fact, you may be legally forbidden from working with those countries, or they may be legally forbidden from working with you. If we look around the world today, we can see many, many examples of this. You cannot do business with countries such as Iran. You can't work with their officials. Just as one example. So what kind of evidence are we generally looking at when we start talking about information or evidence? So things that we might find, purchase orders. So I'll give you an example. I did an investigation here a little while ago, and I was looking at the slack space on a hard drive, and I found um, a UPS tracking number, which was stored on the hard drive. It was stored actually in a page file on a hard drive. And I was able to copy that tracking number that had been left there. It was just sitting on that drive. It just hadn't been overwritten yet. Put that back into UPS's website on their parcel tracker, and I was able to track the entire route that parcel had taken, and I could see where it had been delivered, right? Like who had received it, and I could even see their signature. So other things that we might be able to get: audit reports, email headers, log files. If I look at, go back to my server, and I was to go cat var log. Whoops, let's just see what's in there first. And let's look at messages. Actually, let's take a look at var log secure. So var log sec, whoops, cat var log secure. Oops, I'm typing around items on my desk. Now what I can see here is, if I was to let that run through, you can see all the connection attempts to this server. You can see people who have either connected or failed to connect. So if I was to, for example, cat var log secure, pipe that to grep, and grep, and grep on failed. Look at all the failed password attempts. These are all to be considered attacks on this server. And so takeaways, what kind of evidence are we able to get? A botnet, by the way, botnets are generally stealing this kind of information plus financial credentials, and anything else that might be useful, passwords, and anything else that might be useful. So scanning, a remote system could be scanned. Other places that we look, so in other words, a remote system could be scanned to find out things like open ports, operating system, oops, and so on. We can also do things when we're looking for evidence. We can obviously search the web. Usenet. Usenet is news groups. Quite often we will see people, particularly pedophiles, cyber stalkers, people like this, people with different philias, different people with interest in certain types of technologies may all be using Usenet news groups as a way of communicating. Another technology that we could fit into this same category, oops. Another technology we could fit into this category would be Internet Relay Chat, IRC. The domain name service, DNS or domain name service is the most used utility on the internet. Every time you connect to a website, your computer queries a DNS server to get the address of the computer you're connecting to. Other resources, whatever's available, there are all kinds of applications available. There are all kinds of services that are available over the web that can assist you in finding evidence of evil doing and finding out about people and crimes and tracking them down. Now you should, if you think you can get access to a server or you want to go surfing through somebody's file structure, something like that, probably a good idea to get permission. So that could be simply getting permission from the owner of a computer, getting a writ of assistance, getting a search warrant. What you want to do is make sure that your search is legal. What you want to keep in mind here is that if you do something questionable, then the only thing the defense has to prove is reasonable doubt. You have to prove the crime. It's not going to do anything for your case if you're shown to be doing unethical things. When you're doing some things, if you're scanning a system and that process may disrupt a remote system and you don't have permission, then you're probably going to be considered an attacker. And if you're going to be wanting cooperation from a sysadmin at some point in the future, that's probably not the place that you want to be. Oops. Okay, evidence could be in multiple jurisdictions. In other words, it could be in multiple places under different law enforcement agencies, responsibility under different judicial systems. Get a warrant, get permission. If you can acquire passwords, so if you have a warrant and you find a sticky note on somebody's monitor, or you are monitoring network traffic and you're able to capture plain text.
Okay, I found this on the web for if you're able to capture plain text. Check it out.
Wonderful. We love Siri.
You are the wind beneath my wings.
Okay, so just so you know, when I'm drawing on the screen, I'm actually using my iPad to do that. And my iPad is always listening for me to say certain things. And when I say them, then it responds. Even sometimes I say something that sounds like that. And it's just one of the things we put up with trying to create lectures during COVID. Okay, so you need to be able to plan what evidence it is you want. And make this a living plan. In other words, don't just sit down with a pencil and paper and say, I need this, this, and this. Because when you start gathering evidence, more than likely, your requirements are going to change. The evidence that you acquire is going to dictate new things that you need, new things that you need to prove. Usually a good idea not to do your investigation directly on collected evidence. Usually make a copy of it, take a hash of the initial evidence, and use that hash to actually validate that your evidence hasn't changed. So I'll also go into this in more detail a little bit later. Something you need to also, we also need to remember is that when I go from my presentation slides to my screen, I lose whatever it is that I have actually written on the screen. So I'm just going to post this video as is. So when you're watching this video, you're going to get all the mistakes. You're going to get all the things that went right and so on. So quite commonly, we use MD5. And it should be, pardon me, MD5 sum. All right, so let's get out of that. And let's make a file. So make a file called MD5 demo. And I'm going to insert just a bunch of random data into this file. And then I'm going to save that file on my hard drive. And now I'm going to go MD5 sum, MD5 demo. And it's going to generate a number that looks like this. This is the MD5 sum for this particular file. If the file should change even a teeny weeny little bit, then this sum will change. So when I take original evidence, original digital evidence, I take the MD5 sum, I record that, and I save the original file. I put it away in an evidence locker. I like to use an encrypted container with a strong password. This prevents the data, the original data from being changed. And it means that when I go to court with that evidence, I'm going to court with primary evidence. And that's very important. Okay, so next slide. So when we are looking at a networked system, we have, let's say we have our bad guy. Oops. So our bad guy lives here. And that person is connecting to a victim computer over here. And in between we have the internet, and we generally depict that, we draw that as a cloud. This is not referring to cloud computing. This is simply, and victim should be victim. Whoops, sorry, I misspelled victim. I'm just going to leave that. Victim. This facility doesn't allow me to erase. So when we're looking at the cloud here, what that really means is we don't know what path the packets took between two computers. So what we do is we start our search at the endpoints. And from there, we can use certain commands to explore all the paths and hops that our packets took through switches, proxies, routers, and different systems. Generally, these systems, switches, routers, generally log information of the traffic that passes through them. But we may also have issues with respect to that around the statefulness of that information. In other words, how long does that device store that information? So we need to be adaptive. We need to realize that as we collect information, it's going to lead us to other information, lead us to new ideas. Very important to understand that digital information is extremely perishable. It can be modified, it can be altered, it can be changed so that it leads you into false investigation paths. When you're looking at malicious software, you'll find that the programmers actually will program in false execution paths, things like that. It's not uncommon for somebody who has breached a system to actually modify the connection logs to either hide their presence or make it look like the attack came from someplace else. Always look carefully at your evidence. Always determine whether or not there's further places that you could get evidence. Are there more places on that same computer? Sometimes you want to do your investigation with a camera running over your shoulder. In a networked environment, and we haven't talked about this, but it's very difficult, it's very unlikely that you're going to get a bitstream copy of evidence. Generally, we can make a bitstream copy of a hard drive. And sometimes we can use tools such as Wireshark, things like that, to watch network traffic and get bitstream evidence, and so on. But generally, that's not going to be the case. Most of our network-based evidence is going to come from log files. My estimation, well over 90 to 100% of it's going to come from log files. There is utilities that I talked about. In other words, IRC, Internet Relay Chat. So let me just mark that down here. Internet Relay Chat. IRC, often a place where bad people will hang out. There's lots of good things going on IRC. So if we look at news groups and IRC, the Linux operating system, which has done so much to improve our planet, was developed using those technologies. On the other hand, what's useful for good guys is also useful for bad guys. So most of this information is generally collected from log files. Document, document, document. Authenticated. So you can authenticate that using a hash value. Make sure that you present your evidence properly. Often it is impossible or not easy to get date and time information. This can work against you in court. So some examples, or a example of a where we can find digital evidence is, let's look at the Wayback Machine. So if I was to go here and I was to look at, let's say, bcit.ca, and we can find information going back. And not only that, we can generally get an example of what the web page looked like then. So I'm just watching this progress bar up here. So here we go. BCIT's website long ago. If I did the same thing, for example, with, let's look at ucfv.ca. And you can see it was saved in 2020. And again, we have to wait for the progress bar. Very slow as it goes back into old databases. And here's what it saved about that website. We can look at Google. Google is another useful tool that we can use. Always remember that this information is probably going to be incomplete, but it's something you can use. And it's a standard source. Another website that we can look at is CNN, talking about digital evidence. This article was written in 2005, and it is just as useful today as it was, or just as relevant today as it was in 2005. Other utilities that we can use. So we can use Nixum. And I'll leave it to you to do some investigation on that. You'll find that there's various tools on this website, and just do a little bit of investigation and find out what they do. Profiling. We need to remember that people commit crimes, and those people will have various peculiarities. They will have various philias, they will have various motivations. Quite often today, the motivation for cybercrime is money. On the other hand, it could be different motives. Sometimes we'll see hacktivists, people with a cause. Today, in today's world, we're seeing a lot of activists. So we need to look at associated behavior. And you can study profiling techniques. And if you talk to me, I can definitely recommend some books and sources where you can learn these things. Another textbook, or another online source of information, the HoneyNet Project. And notice they have a series of white papers here called Know Your Enemy. And you can download the PDF, and it'll talk to you. This one is about the social dynamics of hacking. The Cornfacre virus. Malicious web servers. So you just click, and you will find more information than you possibly want to know. So HoneyNet, this website that we just looked at, has a lot of discussion. It talks to you about profiling. It talks to you about the various things that you need to understand. It'll talk to you about the hacker community. It'll talk to you about how exploits, software, all has a life cycle. So if we're talking about software development, we often hear about the SDLC, the software development life cycle. The same thing is true for malicious software. The same thing is true for attacks. They all have various forms of life cycles. They all last, and they're all relevant for a certain period of time. Then they're no longer relevant. Either they become known, they become certain attacks. Virus scanners may now have a signature. We're now seeing artificial intelligence and machine learning to help mitigate attacks on systems. This is making a lot of attacks obsolete. So other things we might be looking at, intelligence-based information and profiling, which we've already talked about. So there are different types of attackers, different types of people. So first of all, we have the clueless people. These are people who might be on a network, or they've downloaded an attack tool or an investigation tool, and to them it's a toy, and they're playing with it. They think they've suddenly become the elite hacksaw, and now they download something These people are easy to catch. They're easy to find. They could be accidentally dangerous, but generally they don't have the skills to make themselves dangerous. They're dangerous because they have access. The internet makes it easy to access software and tools that can be used to do harm. Script kiddies. Script kiddie comes from the idea of a kid in his bedroom, in her bedroom, basically using exploit scripts or ready-made attacks that they've downloaded off the internet. Okay. Next level. This is somebody with experience, an administrator, or somebody who seriously understands computer systems. So we could call this person the guru. Oh, mighty guru. Then, of course, we have people with intimate knowledge of computer systems. Now, these people here are more challenging, and they could come from a variety of backgrounds. They could just have a lot of experience, or they could have degrees. They could have bachelor's, master's, PhDs in computer science. They could have worked in the field for years. They could have just been hackers for years, people with a curiosity. So there is a tool known as Nmap, and we'll be playing with that a bit later on in the course. And Nmap can be used to actually explore computer systems, look for open ports, find active servers, all that type of thing. Nmap is an anagram for network mapping or network mapping tool. There are all kinds of databases of vulnerabilities. People have put these things together. There are password guessing techniques, various ways that an attacker can gain access to a computer system. Once an attacker is in, they may try and escalate their privilege. So they may have exploited a web server. The web server might be running as a user called nobody, who has very few privileges on the computer, and may go from there to finding ways to get higher levels of access to that computer. And we call that privilege escalation. The attacker will do their own forensic exam of the computer. They will look for things like, is there software that might give them away? Is this computer worthwhile? Sometimes they go away and come back. Sometimes they get into a system and they then try and worm their way in the best they can. In the case of botnets, generally the goal is to generate as many installs as possible. And once that computer is infected, it obviously becomes a zombie or a slave on somebody's bot network, and is then used for performing other types of attacks and executing other types of antisocial behavior. Attacks can be automated using something called a rootkit. There are many ways of actually automating an intrusion or automating an attack. So something else that we will talk about. These could be anything from shell scripts. This could be software downloaded off the internet. It could even be contracted. It could be bought and paid for. So there is cybercrime as a service, and this is a growing industry, it's a growing business, particularly promulgated and sold through the darknet. Okay, so what are the fundamentals? What do you want to walk away from this with? Main thing is to understand that the TCP IP suite of protocols was never designed to be secure. Remember that these protocols were originally invented when there was like 2 computers on a network. And it was never ever dreamed that the internet would grow and that these protocols would still be used. But they are with us today. They are fundamental to the transfer and exchange of information on the World Wide Web. They are inherently very insecure, and that attackers will take great joy, and in fact exploit them to the maximum level that they can. So that is really your biggest takeaway. And then understanding that these protocols don't necessarily, or may necessarily, depending on the situation, leave good evidence trails. The other thing you want to take into consideration is the fact that if the bad guys can exploit this, then so can an investigator. But these technologies make it very, very easy to commit crime on a computer network. So as an examiner, determining whether a crime has taken place, determining how a botnet was set up, looking at motivations, you need to understand how TCP IP works. And that will be the topic of a upcoming talk. So anyways, hope you've had as much fun with this as I have, and I will see you in another lecture. Bye for now.